So I'm going to talk to you today. I've got my timer set, so I'll hopefully be able to stick to the 15 minutes, about green into grey, or what we're calling integrated green-grey infrastructure. So a lot of GI policy leaves out those grey spaces that we've seen a lot of today. It talks about greening on buildings, but not particularly well on non-building assets. And importantly, one of the things that some of this research that comes from a wide variety of backgrounds, so from historic conservation research through to coastal processes and coastal engineering research, and a subject called biogeomorphology, if you want to Google that, is actually that some of this greening can actually benefit traditional engineering, and they can actually increase asset resilience. So we may not just be doing it for purely biodiversity gains. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by green into grey or green-grey. Why is it needed? How can we do it, and how have others done it? And then specifically look at this current project where we're trying to put some costs on these kinds of interventions compared to business as usual. These pictures here are from my native Vancouver. The top one is 1970s, roughly spec walls along the harbour. There are some native plants there, but it looks kind of weedy and isn't particularly natural space. The bottom is some interesting landscape architecture that went in around the Olympic Village that was in 2010. And it's a much more natural feel. You're still very much at the core of the city. It's a very urban landscape. So there's things you can do along urban estuarine spaces. And again, GI policy is typically non-salty, so I'm going to add a little salt to your day and get you thinking about other environments and how we green those. And so what is this kind of notion of integrated green-grey infrastructure, and where does it fit within nature-based solutions and GI policy? And so we came up with a definition, which is about seeking to improve the multifunctionality of hard, non-building grey infrastructure assets in our towns and cities by greening the parts of our cities that must remain grey. So you can't replace your roads completely with GI because you need to have some functionality. So the top half of the diagram is what's conventionally in GI policy. I put a tiny little hint at green bridges because it's starting to creep in to GI policy, but it's typically on buildings rather than the non-building grey assets. And with the rise of policies like Net Gain and Future Generations of Wellbeing Act in Wales, there's an opportunity to think about how do we green these other spaces. And a lot of talks today have touched on this. So this is a diagram that we produced, which is looking at different types of interventions. So a pocket park, actually thinking about street furniture differently. Can we green it? Can it have a function? Thinking about guardrails that can be greened, tramways that can be greened, and importantly, along your estuarine, coastal and riverine environments. And importantly, not all of the examples I'm going to show are inherently green. A lot of them are very grey looking. And they're about designing for animals rather than designing for people. First, and you design green plants and the animals will come. It's actually explicitly about designing for animals. So again, quite a different take. So it's important because many traditional GI and nature-based approaches are not suitable for this grey infrastructure that has to remain primarily grey. These most urban cores of our cities have some of the highest climate change pressures in terms of heat island, for example, and the fewest ecosystem services, yet they're where most of us live. So the IGGI identifies ways of greening this infrastructure, and it hopefully, once the project's finished, can start to influence things like GI policy. So where does it sit along a continuum? It kind of sits here between conventional grey and more conventional green infrastructure through to natural system. And in a flood risk context, in England and Wales, they talk about working with natural processes here as a design intervention, and we could think about enhancing hard engineering as being a step along that way towards that. So if we want to think about how can we create this integrated green-grey infrastructure, so it could be temporary features. You could put temporary green hoarding on your building site. That's improving. It's happening more often. You can retrofit features onto existing grey infrastructure. I'll give you some examples. You can design it in as part of new schemes. We spend a lot of today thinking about landscape scale, strategic planning. So some of these ideas are actually feeding into the Humber planning. So where you have Hull and Grimsby, how can you green those grey assets that have to remain grey. So it can form part of strategic planning, such as this London Ecology Master Plan by the Crown Estate. And primarily, this field has kind of started with ecologists or biogeomorphologists looking at how can we improve things for biodiversity to target specific species or sometimes to comply with legislation. So here's an example of a retrofit rock pool, and Sam Buck is here somewhere today representing our consulting. And these were done as part of social cohesion, social education. They're now being used for environmental mitigation. So innovation can happen in a very small scale and can gradually lead to providing environmental mitigation. The people do it to improve environmental quality, air quality, using green screens as buffers, water quality, how do you clean the water before it goes somewhere else, and in terms of extreme event mitigation. But you can also do it for asset resilience reasons. So deterioration is one of the leading causes of decay, of coastal structures, but also our older buildings, our historic conservation fabric. So we've done trials where we've looked at how can you texture concrete on sea walls that might attract species that may protect the concrete. So barnacles appear to protect concrete. Japanese have found a 100-fold decrease in chloride under barnacles. Similarly, on these soft wall cappings, they're between 8 and 23 times cheaper than a hard capping, but they provide a wide range of benefits. And Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland are starting to use these. Can we use those on conventional green walls? We do not see them. So there's tools to improve durability. And as another example, ivy on historic walls, freestanding walls or buildings is not necessarily detrimental. It can actually provide benefit. It can actually protect those walls from soiling. So why can't we roll that out more widely? And people enhance for multiple reasons. In one of the breakout sessions, there was a kind of praise for this Sheffield Green to Grey project. It's largely a sustainable urban drainage project, but there's pockets there where they actually just green the grey without having it be a bioswale. So you can integrate it into other GI measures. So the actual project we have is about broadening the range of GI tools available. Most of them have not been done chiefly by landscape architects. So they're bringing them to this community from a wide range of practitioners, and they're to provide evidence-based case studies and hopefully a simple framework by which you could compare business as usual approaches, traditional grey approaches, to these green-grey approaches. And so we had a prior project, we surveyed 53 users, and we asked them, what do you need to move from innovation to widespread implementation? They wanted guidance. They wanted evidence around asset resilience or that the biology was having no damage. They wanted data on costs, and they wanted a business case and a comparison tools. So we managed to get this project funded, and there's a suite of partners across Wales, England, and Scotland. And it involves local authorities, government agencies, SMEs, as well as academic advisors and some environmental consultants. And it was very much a model of co-production. The project was developed in partnership, and it's developed as it's progressed in partnership. So there's a decision framework that has been developed through using case studies where there's enough data to then create a method that people can use to assess the IGGI you might want to propose against business as usual. We originally proposed that there would be 10 case studies. We actually have more than that. And there's these art of the possible vignettes, which are where we do not have enough data. And if anyone's wondering what that is, that's a prototype of a concrete piece of rock armor that's optimized for biology. So we cover the coastal and estuarine environment, historic environment, urban environment, and one thing that's been pulled out is mowing for pollinators because it segues across all of them. Rivers are left out because there was a sister project that looked at river bioengineering. And the main thing is this project does not cover SUDs, and it doesn't cover buildings, but the grey bits in between. So this is our consulting's bee bench. So it's a bench so to have cohabitation of people and solitary bees who do not bite people. And this is a bee wall, which again, social cohesion project, a knackered bit of a social housing estate. They got the public engaged, and they recreated a wall that provided bee habitat with some wildlife in front. And so we developed a framework of critical success factors. The partners said, we don't want it just to be about ecosystem services. If we want this to be successful, people need to know what motivated people to get these projects off the ground, what policy hooks did they use, and what are some of the engineering opportunities and limitations. So we created these critical success factors, and that's what we've evaluated each case study against. And so each case study was developed using data where it existed and expert judgment. And criteria were set to differentiate between the case studies and the art of the possible. So those that had enough data where you could actually start to do some evaluation between business as usual and the case studies were done as case studies. And the important thing, I think, with this is we brought on Bruce Horton, who's a leading environmental economist who developed Syria's BEST tool, and Jasper Kenter, who's an academic environmental economist, to advise us on this because we're not environmental economists. And the other thing is, having developed best practice case studies in the past, is often they're missing a kind of data quality element. So one of the things that's crucial in our case studies is we have a data quality element. So people will be able to understand that rigor of that data. Another thing that came out was partners said, we want to be able to give it to our engineers and them find what they want quickly. And if we're an environmental person, we want to be able to find it quickly. So this iconography was designed by Sean Pimlott Design, and that was to basically help navigate people through these case studies. And so we have a step-by-step guide that's in draft that people can work through to say, how can we get the overall benefit? What is the engineering costs or benefits of the intervention, the environmental, and the direct costs compared to construction as usual? And so we have bundles for each environment type. So we have a high-level business case, which is kind of a summation of the different case studies. These case studies in Art of the Possible. This is just a thumbnail of the start of the coastal one. But we're kind of trying to address questions that practitioners had said they were facing. So will it work? Will it cost more? What examples are there we can draw on? What are the benefits? What are the risks? How can we get it approved for our own scheme? And this is an example of this business case for mowing for pollinators. So there's probably way more places around the UK than this, but these are the ones that we were aware of. And they very simply, as an evidence summary, can say, it generally costs less, the environmental benefit is positive, the engineering effect is neutral, the data quality is moderate to high. So this is quite high confidence. And it's ticked the policy target and the social value is positive. The corporate response, social image is positive. The asset resilience in this case is neutral. So it gives a weight of evidence for people trying to put these things forward. And this is a case study that's still under development. There's still sections involved, but gives you a feel. So that iconography follows all the way through. So if you're the engineer, you can say, okay, it's got medium value. Let's go and read that section. And the data quality box looks at the site-specific expert judgment as well as wider academic or non-academic sources. And then the next layer down are these Art of the Possibles, and they're less data-rich than the case studies. They can often be research. So one of the things the practitioner said is, we want these examples to be live and operational on real schemes. A lot of the innovation is coming out of the research community, and they're not. We're making small tiles that eventually will hopefully scale up to foam liners that companies like Rakeley might develop. So they fit in an Art of the Possible. And it's Natural England, one of our core partners, said, we want to showcase ideas. We don't want someone to come along and say, well, we can't do mowing for pollinators for ours because it's not a coastal earth embankment. It could be a verge in the middle of your main artery out of town, which is in the case of Hartlepool, which is one of these Art of the Possibles. So it's to try not to limit people's thinking and somebody you're trying to propose it to say, well, that doesn't work here because we're not using brick. You know, it's to try to help broaden the range of ideas. And so because the title of my talk somewhere along the way got changed, and one of the things was about how can it benefit traditional engineering. So I just pluck out the asset resilience element. We have a series of case studies that show that you can actually improve asset resilience through using these IGGI techniques. There's others that have no change. And a lot of them that do this are at the coast or in the historic sector in terms of the improvements. And there's others that have these wider multifunctional benefits. So you can do it for air pollution or biodiversity or water attenuation. But they might have only measured one of those parameters rather than all of those parameters. So it's a little bit imperfect because the data wasn't there. And this, in case you don't know, is salt marshes in front of the O2 Centre in London. Yeah, I've got 15 seconds. So basically, very quickly say the project's going to launch in September. There'll be a webinar. If you're interested, please get in touch. And we're keen to find more case studies. We're also applying for follow-on funding to try to embed some of this within organizations. So if organizations are interested in saying, well, how could these work alongside wider GI planning, we'd be interested in talking to you too. So thank you very much.